Now we move on to China. Lots of revelations because I have seen your videos. But yeah, so please take over.
Right, China is a whole different cup of tea. Uh, so if you think about the history of India, just going by facts, not by stories, according to the hard facts, archaeological evidence, India's civilization dates back at least 10,000 years. The oldest archaeological site in India that has been actually excavated is Birrana in Haryana. It has been carbon dated to about 9.5 thousand years before today. And there are more than 2,000 unexplored archaeological sites along the dry riverbed of the Saraswati. So if you go and explore there, you will find sites, archaeological sites that are way older than Birrana, that is guaranteed. So India's culture, India's civilization is unbroken, and you will find unmistakable evidence of cultural continuity in all these archaeological sites, which means the same culture has been persisting for 10,000 years in different forms, but it is the same culture, the same core culture. So Indian civilization is at least 10,000 years old. Now, the other great civilization, today there are two civilization states. One is India, one is China. The other great civilization is China. They are about 3,000 years old. If you want to be charitable to them, they are about 3,500 years old. That's how old China is, right? And if you look at the founding myth of China, the mythical founder of China is the great yellow emperor, dragon emperor. He comes from the west of China. So he was not Chinese. He came from west somewhere. And he brought culture and civilization and all that order into China. So China is about 3,500 years old, maximum. They have undergone a lot of turmoil. And they have been under Indian influence for at least 2,500 years. So the great Chinese diplomat and statesman Hu Shi wrote that India for 2,000 years completely dominated China without sending a single soldier across the border. What this means is that the Chinese were so enamored with Indian culture once they discovered it that they used to send ambassadors and embassies to India requesting Indian kings and queens and emperors to send scholars to China to translate Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. And lots of these scholars from India went there. There were even wars between various Chinese kings for hosting an Indian scholar. So there was this guy called, what was his name? No, that's later. I forget the name. His mother's name was Jeevasena or something. A very, very famous Indian scholar who was half Kashmiri and half Khotanese. So he was in China. And
Xuanzang.
Not Xuanzang. The Xuanzang was Chinese. Yeah, so I forget the name. Okay, because but the Chinese went to war for him. There were two different Chinese kingdoms. Both wanted to host him. So they went to war with each other. And eventually one of them took this guy hostage and they forced him to marry and have children there. Very, very strange stories, yeah? So, so the Chinese were deeply, deeply impressed with Indian culture. They were so impressed with Indian culture. See, the Chinese, what do they call themselves? They call themselves the Middle Kingdom, right? China has historically called itself the Middle Kingdom, the middle of the earth, the center of the earth. The name for India was Tianzhu. Tianzhu means the center of heaven.
Okay.
The Chinese name for India was Tianzhu, the center of heaven. They called themselves the center of earth, but India was the center of heaven. That is how highly they regarded India, and that's how deeply influenced they were by Indian culture. So many Indian pilgrims, Indian Dharma gurus went there. For instance, there was a king whose name I don't forget. I don't remember Chinese names very easily, but he started a monastery for an Indian guru whose name was Buddha Bhadra. So Buddha Bhadra had gone to China for the purpose of translating Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. He spent many years doing that. Eventually, he passed away. Then the Chinese requested India to send a different monk, a different guru, and the Indians sent a guy called Bodhidharma to this place. So this monastery that was established for the sake of Buddha Bhadra eventually became Bodhidharma's monastery. It's now called the Shaolin Monastery. It is where Buddha Dharma taught the Chinese a yoga-based martial art, which is now called Kung Fu. So Kung Fu originates in India, right? And so much more in Chinese culture has originated in India. China has always been an imperial system. The people of China have typically practiced Buddhism, but the emperors and the ruling class, they typically practice Confucianism or Taoism, a mixture, some kind of balance between Confucianism and legalism. Legalism says that the emperor is the god and whatever he says is the law. Confucianism is a more soft kind of thing. It says that there should be emphasis on family values and all that. But both are atheistic in nature, legalism as well as Confucianism. Confucianism, there is no God in Confucianism. Confucius, yes. Confucius is the guy who started that. So the rulers of China have always had this atheistic mindset. The people of China, they even today China has the world's largest Buddhist population, practicing Buddhists. But the rulers have always had this more hard-nosed mindset. So China has had many, many dynasties in the past 2,500, 3,000 years. Some of these dynasties have been conquest dynasties, which means it is foreigners who conquered China and ruled China. In the 8th century, the Tibetans conquered China and took the capital and installed a puppet emperor in China. Tibet once conquered China. Then what happened is Tibetans became Buddhist, and then they became all dharma, all what ahimsa and all that stuff. Yeah, so Buddhism was kind of, it was not very good for Tibet overall. So China has had many, many dynasties. One of the great dynasties of recent times was the Yuan dynasty, which was a conquest dynasty. It was the Mongols who were ruling China. Yes. So it starts with Shri Chinggis Khan, the great warrior for peace. Yeah, he conquered China for the sake of peace, and he conquered China twice. He took Beijing twice, Chinggis Khan. His grandson Kublai Khan became the first Mongol emperor of China. He established the Yuan dynasty, which is a Chinese dynasty of Mongol origin, and they backdated the first Yuan emperor to be Chinggis Khan, but it's actually Kublai Khan. So the Yuan dynasty lasted for a while, slightly more than a century, and during the Yuan dynasty's time, their soldiers captured large parts of Asia because the Mongols were great conquerors, they were unstoppable. So during the time when a Mongol emperor was ruling China, the Mongols captured lots of lands. Today the Chinese claim that the Yuan dynasty was a Chinese dynasty, and all these conquests legitimize our territorial claims on other nations, even though this is a dynasty that had itself conquered China. By which logic Mongolia should own China actually today. Yeah. So that is the convoluted logic that the Chinese use. Then you had the various other dynasties, and then in the early 19th century you had a civil war in China. There was a Japanese occupation of Manchuria, Manchukuo. They actually did much worse. The Japanese, the one blot on the history of Japan is their treatment of the Chinese civilians in the run-up to Second World War. Horrible, horrible. That is a stain they can do nothing about, especially what they did in Nanjing. That's a different story. I'll not talk about it because it's too ghastly. So yes, in the early 20th century, the last Chinese dynasty fell. Then there was a civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists. Eventually, the communists took over. The Kuomintang had to escape to Taiwan Island, where they still essentially rule. So Taiwan is regarded by the Chinese as a renegade, runaway province. And Mao Zedong was able to prevail in the Chinese Civil War after a horrible civil war, lots of bloodshed. They took over China.